both as an academic and as someone who does practice in this industry, I'm inspired by compassion. I think compassion is super important, and our jobs wouldn't work if it wasn't there. But I'm really interested and kind of fascinated by these moments where we do something that we think is nice, and the other person is suddenly offended by it. We say something because we're trying to share our time and space with them, and they're like, I don't want your pity. You know, we do things, right, but that doesn't always get read in the right kind of way. Now, one of the things that's interesting is when you go through and you read about compassion by people who study it, almost always compassion gets studied from the perspective of the service provider, of the compassion giver. Right? You go into hospice and you interview hospice nurses. Tell me, and they more or less the interviews are like what I'm asking you. Tell me a time you demonstrated compassion, right? And hospice nurses can reflect on when they communicate compassion. But there's this whole other side to it, which is how is compassion taken on the other end? How is it received? We know that communication is a two-way street. Why is it that we almost always study this from the perspective of the giver and not from the perspective of the receiver? So that is my project in a nutshell. My name is Tim Huffman, and I wear various hats. I research at the Hugh Downs School of Human Communication at ASU. I'm in my last year of my PhD. I have one dissertation to write before I'm all done. And I study organizational communication, which is how communication creates human action in a coordinated way, right? What goes on to make the organizations that we live in a daily life. I also am the executive director. It's a volunteer position for Stand Up for Kids Phoenix. We're an outreach organization that serves homeless youth. So I am just like all the rest of you, and not very well paid either. So those two things are very related in my life, because obviously I go out into the fields and it creates all of these questions, and then I go back into the classrooms and it answers some questions, but then creates new questions, and I go back out into the field. Yeah.
Well, we just get paid slightly more than you do.
Right, just a little, yeah. Nominally. And I'm also a teacher. I teach communication courses at ASU. And I am also a trainer inside organizations. So these three things are my life. This is what my life pretty much looks like: teaching, action, and research. And I think they happen to be all three spokes of the same wheel. And this project is an engagement of that at a broad level. It is what I'm writing my dissertation on. But before I get into all of that, I want to ask this question, because if I can't answer it, then you should leave. Because I'm a communication scholar, and if I can't demonstrate to you what homelessness and communication have to do with each other, then what am I selling, right? What exactly am I doing here? So often we think there are a dozen ways, 1,000 ways of thinking about homelessness. You can think about it from a sociological perspective. You can think about it from an economic perspective. You can think about it from a trauma perspective or a psychological lens. I happen to look at it from a communicative perspective. So for instance, we talk about a culture that kicks people to the curb and doesn't care about them, right? A culture that hides homelessness, a culture of not in my backyard or not my problem, right? How is culture made? Culture is a communicative process. It's taught, it's reproduced, it's spread out through people. So at the high level, the problems that we face are ultimately cultural or communicative problems, right? Drop down a level. We have service organizations that serve homeless people. Organizations are communicative processes. A mission statement is communicated, a schedule is communicated, the values of an organization are communicated. Organizing is basically communicating, right? And then finally, when we get down to our actual job, the thing that we do when you provide service, what do? Maybe you're a case manager, maybe you're an outreach worker, but ultimately what you're doing is engaging in interpersonal communication on that one-on-one level. So whether it's high up here at culture or sort of at the middle level of organizations or at the one-on-one, it's an inherent part of what we do is communicative. Now, you might not think of yourself as a communication expert or communicatively trying to solve homelessness, but you are. So that's why hopefully this presentation matters. Right? So with that in mind, the project that I'm working on right now, that I'm writing my dissertation on, that I'm doing research on, is driving at these three questions. One is very pragmatically oriented. I'm a research problem kind of guy, solve a problem. If I'm going to know a ton about something, it might as well be useful to some folks. So how can we improve services to homeless young adults that they get from nonprofit human service agencies? So as a person who works with a homeless youth agency, I picked a particular population. It happens to be youth. Did you have a question?
Yeah, can I ask you quickly what your thesis is going to be on?
What I'm about to tell you.
What are you actually saying?
Homeless youth, Standard for Kids serves anyone 24 and under. The research project is between 18 and 24 for institutional review board reasons. They didn't want me to study people under the age of 18 based on their yeah, so this study specifically is young adults 18 to 24. That is a really interesting population though, because they're too old for foster care, but really not necessarily appropriate to just be thrown into the general adult population. So it still is this kind of boundary age, and so it becomes an important thing to study. So how can we improve services? That's the first research question of the project that I'm working on. The second is just how do youth interact with organizations? So broad kind of interaction question. And then most specifically is what do their experiences tell us about compassion inside these organizations? So kind of back to that original blind spot that we started the presentation with. So all researchers have research questions. These are mine, right? And I'm in the process of answering them and have partial answers on them, and we'll get into them very quickly here. But before I do, I want to tell you a little bit about my research method. You might say, Tim, why do I care about your research methods? Research methods matter because depending on the method, it tells you what you can and can't do with the information. So I'll kind of run through what it is and how I collect data and what that looks like for me. And then I'll also just briefly talk about how that kind of means what you do when you're applying it. So I call myself a community-based participatory action qualitative researcher. So community-based, that's not hard. I operate in the community. I'm not like I am an academic, so there is an ivory tower, but I kind of figure that towers are useful because you can hang high lamps from them and illuminate things, or put like stuff in the storage facilities so that it can be pulled out. I'm very practical, right? So while
You're a CPA QR.
yeah, right. Exactly. So based in the community, right? Participatory action is another part of my research title. Basically, it means that there's always an action component to what I do, and also I don't consider myself a know-it-all researcher who invents a theory and then wanders around telling professionals what to do. Instead, I think of myself as a professional who happens to be in school, and I might know some things that you don't, and you know some things that I don't. And so when we come together, we know more. It's ultimately a stakeholder model, and this process is based on, there are 4 places that we need to tap in order to improve services and answer my questions. Yes, some of that is from the academy. Yes, some of that is from management inside organizations, but an equal voice needs to be given to staff and volunteers inside organizations and the homeless youth that we're trying to serve, right? And I believe that knowing is a human enterprise, and everybody does it. You don't have to write papers to know stuff. We all know things, and that when we mutually participate, then we get closer to useful knowledge that helps us move forward in the community. The last little bit, qualitative research, if you're not familiar. Quantitative is like with numbers, right? Surveys, experiments, that kind of stuff. Qualitative research is basically finding, situating, and analyzing the textured experience of lived human interaction. That's a complicated way of saying adjectives. We really look at the how, what it feels like, what it's like, what is happening there. I don't knock surveys. I think survey methodologies are really important and they help answer some questions. Surveys are really good for saying whether or not something is happening broadly, and there are methods for basically sorting out whether or not this is because of chance, and that's basically what you get from quantitative methodologies, and super useful, but they're not as useful for telling you what it's like to be in a place, and that's where qualitative research really shines. So we're gonna, now that I'm like hopefully really excited, wow, this is a great project, and please tell me what you found. So the way I went about gathering actual research and getting data is by doing interviews. And these interviews ranged from about 15 minutes for people who just wanted the gift card, to like an hour and a half, 2 hours of people who had no other place to be and really wanted me to understand what was going on. So some of them were, you know, almost perfunctory, right? Yes, you answer my questions, and here's the Jack-in-the-Box card. And others of them were these awesome opportunities where people really tried to help me understand. So I've done 23 interviews to date, and the goal is 30, so I'm not completely done with my data collection, but I'm done with the primary phase. And so that's one section of data. The other is I'm an ethnographer, so I write field notes. Basically everywhere I go, I take notes, or if I can't take notes because I'm too busy handing out food or talking to people, I take notes afterwards. So I'm pushing, I'm a little over 100 single-spaced pages of field notes, basically based on reflections on these questions inside the field. So most of what I'm going to tell you today is drawn from the interviews, and the findings basically break down into a couple of things. I'm going to talk about interaction and the positive and negative and helpful and unhelpful interactions that homeless youth have inside human service agencies. The second are specific interactions that they find problematic and specific interactions that they find helpful. And so this is not just things that volunteers do or staff do, it's how they do them. So that's useful to us to see, oh wow, this is how this behavior is getting read by them. We'll also talk about, one of the questions that I ask them is, what does it take to make a good and just organization? So we'll spend a little time on that. And then lastly, I ask them for suggestions and for improvement. And while you'll need to take some of them with a grain of salt, I will tell you them, and you can decide which ones you need more or less salt for. So I was very heartened when I started doing this research to find that a majority of the interactions that homeless youth have inside human service agencies are positive, and they go on and on about all of the different things. Now, before I get into it, I want to mention something. I would say, tell me about a positive experience or a positive interaction you've had inside a human service agency. And they'd be like, well, they feed me. And at first, I was like, that's not an interaction. That's just a service. Can you tell me about, no, like a conversation you had with a staff member? And they could answer that question too. But I find it telling that when I ask about interactions, they talk about services. So while you think your relationship with them is between you and them, it's kind of not. Yes, that's part of it, but their interaction, they also interact with the organization as an entity. And so the policies, the operating hours, all of the different things that they have to do, the actual physical space, all of those become part of their interaction with you. So it might be weird to say, what were some of the positive interactions you had? They say, wow, they fed me real food, like good food, that was good. That's an interaction. They also they talked about how interactions inside these organizations help them celebrate their success and how important that was. Humor came up a ton. I was not looking for humor at all, but humor, maybe it's something specific to youth, maybe it's something that's helpful to all homeless people experiencing homelessness, but volunteers and staff who used humor, they saw as more compassionate as ones who didn't. And they would also talk about people who took their job too seriously, as in didn't have enough levity, as people who had no compassion at all. Another thing that surprised me is that they really value ordinary interaction. Mm-hmm. And that takes a second to like actually sink in why that's valuable. But I'll give you some direct quotes from the interviews. This was after this person had left a program but was still having some problems, but went to the zoo with two of the staff members. And he says, it was 3 drug addicts and 1 drug addict's daughter hanging out. not thinking about drugs, not talking about drugs, just having a wonderful time hanging out with each other. But it was the most uplifting thing. I can be normal again. It's the first time that I had any hint that I could be normal again. So sometimes we want transformative, compassionate experiences. Oh, I'm good to you, and wow, like my world explodes. It doesn't always happen that way. Oftentimes, normal is so much better than the alternative that just treating them like you treat everybody else in the world can be pretty powerful. Another example of you not having any clue of the impact that you have on people, I asked about what was the most compassionate experience you ever had in an organization. And I got a variety of answers. But one of them kind of took me aback. He says, it was when? About 2004? Okay, so right off the bat, he's telling me about an experience that happened 8 years ago.
That's awesome.
Right? What?
That's awesome?
Yeah, okay. So here's what he remembers from 8 years ago. My grandma ended up passing away. It was only me and my mom. And my mom was breaking down in tears every day, and I was a chore boy for a while. But I kept bottling things up. My feelings were just bottled. I didn't know how to show them. And one day, one of the people at the organization, I forgot their name, but they ended up looking at my face and was like, is something wrong? And I go, well, I didn't want to say, because it was personal. And I was like, because it's my family. So I said, yeah, I'm having some troubles. And they were like, okay, if you need to talk, we're there for you. Now, I can honestly say that I didn't talk to them because it was on a need-to-know basis. But they asked. Okay, so 8 years ago, somebody asked this kid if he was okay. And he said, yeah, some issues. And they said, okay, well, we'll talk about it. And when I ask him the most compassionate experience he's ever had, that's the one that he gives you. Chances are, I don't remember who their name is, doesn't remember this conversation either. Right? How many times have you asked someone, how are things? Okay, or not so good. It's fantastic the difference that can make. Heartening. A common theme that ran through the interviews, this is probably one of the most often quoted phrases, people who give a shit. I apologize if you don't want to hear cussing, but these are direct interviews. Giving a shit apparently matters. And when I ask, how do you know whether or not someone gives a shit, they have an elaborate response to how they know that when they don't. And we are about to get into that. So some negative experiences that they've had inside these organizations. Getting made angry by people. Oh yeah, they would just piss me off so much when I talked to them. I would just be mad the whole day and not really care about anything. This is not an uncommon reflection that I got. Even worse, this one just made me want to vomit. The staff was being a royal pain in the ass. He was basically nagging and bitching and screaming and moaning in order to get everyone out who wasn't supposed to be there. And if anyone had a problem with it, he would say, why don't you go and get a life? Or why don't you do something with your life? And when I asked this person, I was like, what does that do to you? He said, well, it threw me off. And I said, how long? He's like, well, I went to the library and blew off some steam. I said, so a couple of hours? He's like, no, I'm still not over it. It's like, how long ago was it? 2 weeks ago? All right, so the capacity, now, I want to add the caveat here that just because it's bad on one end doesn't mean that the person who said something is some kind of monster, right? It's always interactive and it's always mutual, right? So clearly there's stuff going on in this kid's life that makes negative comment last for 2 weeks. But it's worth knowing that we have, impact on people. Another thing that really irks them is when they get in trouble for things that aren't their fault. Now, of course, how am I supposed to know if it's not their fault? I'm just asking them questions. So, right, it's always their side of the story that I'm getting. But it's fairly common for people to say, oh, you know, I was hanging out with these people and they weren't doing good things, but I wasn't doing bad things, but I got in trouble because of them. So that is definitely that's definitely a negative thing that they experience. Also, being not welcome is another thing. I hear, and this one's really easy to implement, I hear people say things like, yeah, I got there and they were rude to me, or yeah, I got there and nobody talked to me, or yeah, I got there and I had no idea where anything was, right? So tours are apparently an important thing. I know that's something that we all know, but it's worth being reminded. So, negative, that's a summary. I also asked them about helpful and unhelpful interactions, and I think this is a really important distinction for us to make as practitioners. Positive means feels good, and I define this for them in the interview. Negative means feels bad, right? Helpful means accomplishes something, and unhelpful means prevents something from happening, right? And while positive experiences are often helpful, and negative experiences are often unhelpful, it's not always the case that there's a one-to-one correlation between those things. It can be helpful and negative, or positive and unhelpful. And we'll get into that in a second. So, helpful. Encouragement is a huge important part. That's not going to be surprising. They say, they just got me feeling excited about life again. It made me feel like I could be confident. An interesting reflection on helpful. I was interviewing one youth, and he says, "Oh, helpful case managers. They're extremely helpful." And I was like, "Well, why are case managers helpful?" And he says, "Well, they're the brick wall that prevents you from getting anything. And the only way to get in is if they give you a pebble or a grenade to get through the wall." Kind of thing. They're the ones who prevent you from doing or grant you permission to go, right? So. As people who engage in case management understand that this is part of the perception, while we're like, oh, we're here to help you, they also see you as a step that is between them and the thing that they need, right? And so it's not always, oh, this gracious moment where you spent your time. As case management is equivalently a gatekeeping thing. And we know that from an organizational perspective, right? If we had all of the utility money to give everybody all of the time, we'd be less worried about case management because we could just give it out, right? Case management becomes a way of picking the winners and the losers, or who it's going to make the best difference for, right? And that's a hard thing to admit, but we're not fooling them. They get that, right? That you're a wall. So try to be a compassionate wall and give them grenades when you can, right? Yeah, so amazingly, I cannot tell you how many people said helpful. They helped me get a food handler's card. Apparently food handler's cards, they just kind of grab onto. So I would never have suspected that food handler's cards was an important way of making somebody feel confident about their prospects in the future. But sometimes just little bureaucratic steps actually do inspire them. So let's move on to unhelpful. We can be extraordinarily demotivating. The staff's way of saying, go do something with your life, just threw me off course. It makes me feel like I am a worthless piece of shit. So, now that's a negative interaction, but he goes on to explain how he doesn't want to do anything when he feels that way, right? And if they don't want to do anything, we can't get them to, right? That motivation's got to come from the inside. So, that's worth knowing. Another thing that they found unhelpful is something that we might call a referral. Many people, I wish they would hire people who gave a rat's butt about people and their problems. You go to a staff member and say, oh, I have such and such an issue. And they say, okay, go and talk to this person. It's not my job to take care of you. And then they start having a hissy fit. Now, is it possible that there are staff out there saying, it's not my job to take care of her? Possible, right? It's possible that we have some people who are having some very bad days. But this is one where it's important to get the intersection between policy and actual interpersonal interaction. When he may hear, it's not my job to do this when I say, oh, there's an engagement coordinator who does that, right? I didn't say not my problem, but I mean, I did, just, I implied it, right? But they're interpretive creatures who are trying to figure out the world, and so they'll hear also what we're not saying, even you know, that we're not trying not to say it, right? So the kind of not my problem thing supports both of these reflections in the beginning of the presentation, which is that taking someone through and demonstrating that, you know, no, I'm not just going to push you off onto the next person all of the time is extraordinarily helpful, and they identify that. Another thing that they find not helpful is being preached at. They find it being very unmotivating. Now, part of this is just kids, right? These are 18 to 24-year-olds. How many 18 to 24-year-olds do you know that like being told what to do? That's not a homeless condition. But, right? I think it's funny when people are like, ah, all these homeless kids on drugs. I'm like, homeless? That's a homeless problem? I go to ASU. But they don't necessarily, but it also relates to these questions of agency, control, and self-determination and freedom inside our programs. But I had one particularly say, I had one staff who told me that there was no way I was going to survive if I didn't have God in my life. I'm a hardcore atheist. I'm not opposed to the idea of God or people who are religious, but I don't believe in God. I always wished I believed in God, but I've never really kind of gotten into it in that way. So I was like, what am I doing here? I'm wasting my time. Fuck. Thanks for the help. So, you know, keep in mind, this is, I like to call this one world syndrome, when a person knows what helped them, and then they cast out into the entire world. The solution to my problem was the solution to everyone else's problem. Right. And that might not be God for you. You might not be preachy when it comes to religion. But I know some people who are like, you have to go to school. School is the only way to do it. And it's not. Trust me, like there are plenty of successful people in the world who didn't get a college degree and they went on to succeed. And people who don't see that future when they get told that's the only way, boom, not helpful. So let's complicate this a little bit. Talk about the helpful and positive, helpful, negative, unhelpful, positive, unhelpful, negative. Now most, like I said, fall across the lines that you'd suspect, right? So a lot of what I've shared already falls into these grids. And you should be heartened that it's most easy for them to come up with things that are in the upper left-hand corner. So 2 points to us, right? We're being helpful and positive generally. But there are nuances that go through there, and I think at this moment particularly worth highlighting what falls into the counterintuitive cells. So positive, so feels good, but unhelpful, doesn't help them accomplish things. I got a couple reflections on sometimes I'll have a problem with the organization, or the issue with the policy. I'll go and talk to somebody about it. I'll understand, but nothing will change and it still sucks. So, and that's, if you can't change the policy, if you're not in a position to change the policy, that's the best that you can get in that situation. Because if you have an unhelpful policy, the best thing you can be is positive. But it sheds some hope, I feel, on, wow, even when I tell someone no, these kids aren't, some of them are spoiled, but they're not spoiled brats saying, well, I didn't get my way, so they must have been a monster. They're very capable of saying, you know, it didn't help me. They couldn't do anything. But, you know, they were at least polite. So when you hear them say, oh my gosh, I hate this place, don't automatically assume, oh, well, they must think that because they didn't get their way. Because they are capable of identifying the difference between those two things. Another positive but unhelpful they cite is interactions with each other. So most of the youth will say, feels good but not helpful, the time I spend with my friends. But client interaction is obviously a challenge because you don't have to be a saint in order to be helped by us. There are some people who are in very bad places and treat people very badly. And so client interaction can obviously be a great source of negativity, but they are also the first to admit that, yeah, sometimes we distract each other. And that's worth keeping in mind from a programmatic perspective. So helpful and negative. What played out here? I had one person say about expectations. It was like, how the fuck am I going to do all this? I have to go to a fucking meeting every fucking day. I've got to not want to do drugs. Like, all this shit. And it's like, I've got kitchen duty, I've got to go to class, and I'm not allowed to leave. It's starting to be really shitty, but it ultimately was really helpful. So, you know, expectations bite both ways, right? Because this also fell into the, if I get told something that I can't do, you know, that can be very demotivating. But there are also times where when you hold someone to a high but realistic standard, it ultimately pushes them forward. And they, albeit vulgarly, are totally willing to admit that. Another negative but helpful, I thought this was interesting. This was from an interviewee who said, I stay around in an organization because of the vibe. That's how he described it, because of the vibe. And I was like, what kind of vibe is that? He's like, oh, it's got to be a positive vibe. More people than not have got to be kind of like, you know, doing good and interacting with people and thinking about good things and on the right track. But, he said, not everybody has to be. He says, sometimes people doubt me. And when I doubt me, I want to prove them wrong. So now, I think that his little formula, though, is important to keep in mind, because sometimes we play the tough love card. We're like, you know what? You know, I'm going to be the one who, like, really, you know, pushes this person. And in the back of our head, we're like, well, you know, I'm going to empower them because they're going to... Okay, that works, but everyone can't be doing that, right? He's got to have mostly positive, and he says 1 or 2 doubters is okay, right? So when you are staffing organizations or trying to make decisions about your own kind of personal touch, you might want to consider this like 80-20 mix, right? If 8 interactions are positive and 2 of them are doubtful, that might be highly motivating. At least for some. If 8 of them are highly doubtful and the other 2 are very negative, probably the tough love game stops working when it's only love. I love only tough. I love the shock treatment. Yeah, okay. You need treatment and not just shocking, right? So expectations are sometimes very negative experiences, but ultimately helpful. I had another person really say, oh God, I hated intake. It was just personal and up in my business and talking about all my problems and asking me all this stuff, but man, how are they going to help me if they don't know what I need? So while you may get complaints about intake, and I'm not saying that intake is never problematic, some of them are definitely willing to say, no, I see through this. So those are kind of the general things that happen inside organizations that they see as positive, negative, helpful, and unhelpful. Now, I want to take a slight move, so instead of talking about what is being done, I want to talk about the how. So, for a moment, let's address specific communication behaviors, things that you actually enact, that they receive poorly or that they receive well. So, repetition in your verbal communication, they read as bored, disconnected, and unengaged, which I think is interesting, because don't we talk about engagement? Right? How can we get them more engaged? Don't be unengaged. So you can tell by the way they act. You've got somebody, and he says this in a grunting voice. Yeah, here you go, here you go. Just by the repetition, you know that they're there for the paycheck. Probably the second most often thing that was said in the interviews was the phrase, just for a paycheck. They read people who are there for the purpose of their own well-being through money as something that's not about them. And maybe that's short-sighted, maybe it's not, but often when asked about why they enjoy volunteers, they say, volunteers are there because they actually care about me. Now, we can't staff all of our organizations with volunteers, but it is worth considering how can I strategically use volunteer staff to increase the perception of caring, because it's not all about the paycheck, right? Also recognize that he knows you're just there for the paycheck. when you're repetitive. So it kind of actually doesn't even matter if you're getting a paycheck. It matters if you're bored, right? Because if you don't seem to have another motivation for being there, then they're going to fall back on the financial one. Another thing that, so repetitiveness, not bad, not good. You've got to try to find a way to change up your verbal tone. If you're letting people in the door, maybe pick 3 different ways of greeting people and cycle between them so that the people in line haven't heard you say it exactly the same way. Yes, this is a little bit of a learning curve because you've got to know more than one, but it's really simple. Sometimes stupid little stuff like that makes a difference, because if I introduce you to my organization in a slightly different way I did to the person before, I train volunteers, and every once in a while someone will get stuck in the same volunteer training, and if I say everything exactly the same way, oh, they're rolling their eyes, they've got less respect for me, oh, you go through the same shtick all the time, and if I'm like, God, I do this all of the time, I have to have one shtick, right? But finding just ways to decrease the perception of repetitiveness increases the perception of authenticity. Another thing that they talk about is staff just staring at the computer. And I got to admit that I mean, I'm on board with them on this. And I think that if you think about organizations that you've walked into, and if you weren't looked at in the first 2 minutes by the staff member who's there, and instead they stared at the computer unblinkingly for those entire 2 minutes, you'll have a feel about whether or not they want you to be there also. Now, I get that our computers are important. It's where our data is kept. It's where our data is entered. It's how we communicate with our staff. It's how we, get memos out. All of those things are important. But do you know what they think you're doing on the computer? Facebook. Facebook, all right? Doesn't matter if you don't have a Facebook account. We're talking about youth, right? They think you're on Facebook, right? They think you have gone off to a world where they don't matter, because you're not their friend on Facebook. Now, if you were Facebooking them, they might have it out on their phone because they picked up on your Wi-Fi already. Even though they don't have service, they figured out that they can get Wi-Fi through a lot of phones these days. Anyway, and that might be a lovely conversation. Hey, look up from your computer, I need intake. Anyway, so the way technology mediates our communication is important to keep in mind. And your front desk workers having a computer that they can disappear to may be good for their sanity, but it may not be good for the sanity of their clients, which may have an impact on the sanity of your worker. Obviously rude and disrespectful, we've been through some of those examples. Communication behaviors that were well received. Newsflash, smiles, okay? You came to a conference to get told that smiles were important. Try. Another thing that they talk about is people who remember their names. It's not so much that they say, oh, they didn't know me, it's more that they're very touched when a name is remembered. Eye contact also. I think eye contact is more than just a good organizational practice. I think this is a social justice issue. We live in a world where, in order to not feel bad about not giving somebody who's spanging or asking for money, the kids call it spanging, spare change. People who are begging, how do you not feel guilty about it? You don't make eye contact, right? This is the #1 way that we can say, no, I'm not going to have this conversation with you. So there are a lot of folks in their day that are explicitly avoiding eye contact. I would encourage you to explicitly engage in eye contact in ways that, and they'll notice. Speaking of noticing when something is wrong and asking. Obviously, I shared that before. I'm still humbled by that reflection that a staff member noticing 8 years ago that I might have a problem in my life, and me not being willing to talk about it, but that apparently works. Following up is another behavior that they are very much a fan of. Following up means you care. That's what they say. Because if they didn't care, they wouldn't follow up. Which is another, you can also read that as they didn't follow up, they didn't care. Right? So if you start thinking about all the different ways you can refer someone from one place to another, and referrals are a reality of our service system, right? that you can say, oh, go here, but if that's all you say, then that's a you're not my problem, right? Because they don't like. If you help them get there, now that takes more time, and I get that we are strapped and underpaid, but if you can, decrease other parts of your job, make it so your staff has less busy work to do and can boundaries span more, and then that follow-up, just the next time you see them, hey, did you talk to them? Where are we in that process? They find that very, very humanizing. Ultimately, they also talk about willingness to suffer. A lot of times we try to make everything go smoothly, and we think disasters are really bad. But sometimes they say things, man, the best time I had was when the water broke, and the AC broke, and there were volunteers cooking us lunch in the kitchen in 112-degree temperature. I would not have said that was the best day. That was not my favorite day, but it was a transformative experience for them. So we like things to go easy, but sometimes when they go hard, but they keep going, they read that as something that's really powerful. Now, the last thing I want to say about communication styles is that this stuff matters. I was talking to one of the youth, and he said, positive interactions is everything. And I said, why is that? He says, well, when I've got nothing to look forward to, then I don't think about the future. Okay, now, how are you going to get somebody to get into housing who doesn't have a job and doesn't have a car and doesn't have health care and doesn't have an ID to get into housing if they don't think about the future? A present orientation, I would argue, is probably more problematic than any other attribute your client can have, an unwillingness to think about the future. Right? We call it irresponsibility, but it's actually a temporal orientation. Instead of looking into the future, I look at the present. There are two ways to be in the present. One is fatalistically, nothing that I do matters, so I'm not going to do anything. Or hedonistically, I'm just going to do whatever I want. And neither of those are great for long-term planning. Right? So he says, when I have interactions to look forward to, then I start thinking, okay, what can I do? Where am I going? What's next? Because I'm looking forward to next week. So when I get all ticked, I'm like, why aren't you doing what you need to go move forward? If forward isn't a happy place to think about, why would you think about it? So it matters. I guess that's what I'm saying. One of my favorite questions, so much of my interviews focused on compassion, but at the end of it I would say, okay, I believe compassion is important to running a good and just organization. What, in addition to compassion, would you say that we need? Now this is like high-level stuff. Tons of them say respect. You can't treat me with compassion if you don't have respect. That's pity, actually, right? Or disdain. I can look at you and go, oh, you poor thing, what a miserable life you have. Right? Is that going to like change a lot of lives? I mean, it's compassion, right? I'm suffering for you because the sucky life you lead and all the horrible choices you made. God, it'd be really hard to be you. Not gonna win a lot of hearts, right? So respect becomes a really important partner to compassion. If you have compassion without respect, they can kind of handle that. They've got, say, a case manager who does all of the things that they need and treats them like an adult but isn't super nice to them. They're not upset about that, but the compassion without respect, man, they don't want to be babied. Now, I mean, that's not a unique trait to 18 and 24 homeless folk, that's an 18 to 24-year-old thing. They don't like to be babied. So respect. They're with us. Resources. You can't help me if you don't have resources, right? So that's not a news flash. There was one or two who talked about being protective of client information, understanding, dedication, and then finally humor. We brushed on humor a little, but it comes up a lot. I know that we are professionals and we work in a professional environment, and it's important to keep a professional persona, but finding ways to insert the humor back into a situation can be transformative. So lastly, in the findings, were there suggestions for improvement? And like I said, I am not going to tell you to do these things. I'm telling you what they told me. right? So give me a bigger building, right? There was another one which was, you know how you can improve it? Close it down. This is a reality that we deal with. There are places an organization can get to with the clients that it serves that it is so derogatorily seen that they would rather it not exist so that there was a chance for something else to exist. Now, I'm not saying that we need to go and close those organizations down, but be on the lookout, because those people, the ones who say closed it down, none of them access services from that institution anymore. So when they're saying close it down, they are effectively no longer reachable by that organization, which I would describe as a service failure, right? So close it down. Oh God, employ people who use their brain was another. One said they really need to employ people who use their brain. I said, well, what do you mean by that? I don't care what anybody says. Just because it's cheap labor, recently released prison convicts are not good counselors. They don't care at all. So I say, do you want people who don't have a background? And then he says, I just want people who actually know what they're doing. Okay, so I will say that there is some pushback from the peer support model. They don't necessarily get a ton, the youth don't necessarily get a ton of support from older homeless or almost ex-homeless who are employed by institutions. Now, I'm not saying that that's a bad policy. As I said before, I'm not making suggestions. I'm just carrying voices, right? But they see those people as uncompassionate, don't care, and more likely to be rude to them. Whether or not that's actually the case, I don't know, but that's at least their impression, right? I also got a lot of improve the environment reflections. I would change the color of that place. Don't just make it plain and white. Throw some color into it. Put some murals on the wall or something. Put some inspirational messages up. Try to make it more lively. Also, better food, better bathroom, better shower, better environment altogether. The best I could. And when he was going through the list, I was like, don't have the money, don't have the money, don't have the money, right? Like, this is what I'm thinking. But then he ends it with, the best I could. And I think that it's easy for me to say, you know what, it's there, it's better than nothing, and then to be done. And I would just encourage, better than nothing, yeah, is better than nothing, but the best we can, that's the thing to shoot for. Sensitivity training, maybe some sensitivity training for the counselors. What do you mean by that? Well, they know how to do things because that's the way they've been done in the past. But your friend's just been shot in the chest with a shotgun, maybe you could be a little more understanding. Maybe a client smoked some spice and we have to kick him out, but don't ostracize him for it. Just kick him out.
True that.
So they're really capable of understanding the difference between a policy administered for the sake of justice and a policy administered with scorn. And they're not interested in being ostracized, even if they're willing to say, I did drugs and I got kicked out and that was the rule and I knew that, right? So he says sensitivity training, but kind of bracketed in there is the ability to administer policies but in a humane way, right? They're not asking for handouts. Do you notice this? They're not saying, gosh, I wish they wouldn't kick me out for doing drugs. Change that rule. Nobody said that. Nobody says that. And when I say, why don't you go there anymore? And they say, well, I got kicked out. I say, why? So I messed up. Every once in a while they say, man, that staff member had it out for me and did everything they could to kick me out. But that's less common. But even the ones who say that will also own to their own failures. At least to me. Maybe not to you. Maybe not in the fight. But as they work through it, they get it. They also talk about consistency in service delivery. They say about how it really sucks when they walk all the way to a place and it turns out that the place isn't open, or if they're relying on a service to be open at a time and that changes. I think that service delivery and timing is a broad issue that's related to staff funding, and I don't know how to solve it, but it is something to keep in mind. If you're going to start a program or offer a service, try to make sure that you can be reliable about that when that thing is open. And they also want urban camping laws to change. And regularly ask me to advocate for them. One of them said, now these tents are banned. Now these places are trespassing because, quote unquote, better society doesn't want them around. Wouldn't it be better if they actually had a place to live outside instead of trying to pay for a place to live inside? Actually forcing them to go indoors or forcing them to find another spot. Instead, we just have city plots and city plots and city plots when there could be city plots and places to camp. And I think that would improve quality of life. Anyway, you may or may not agree with that philosophically, but that is definitely on their mind. And then lastly, they suggest that instead of telling them what to do, we should help them ask their own questions and come to their own answers. So, where do we go from here? I'm going to pause before I answer that question and give you a chance to ask questions. Do you have questions about the research process, about things that I found, about a thing that you want me to clarify more? Yes?
Where did you, in what locations did you interview?
Yeah, so through my connections with Stanford for Kids, I interviewed some people who were at Stanford for Kids. I also interviewed people on the streets. So I would just go out with a recorder and a folded up piece of paper and ask questions. I also got permission from Tumbleweed in Tempe, and so those were my three kind of primary recruitment locations: Stanford for Kids, Tumbleweed, and the streets.
And the age factor was always 18 to 24?
18 to 24, yeah. Yes?
Well, this question might be best suited for the end of this discussion.
Okay.
But I want to be as good a communicator as you. And
Okay.
it flows from your whole body. I like that.
I study it, so yeah, I hope
What can we do if we want to be better communicators?
Yeah, I mean,
Just in a nutshell.
I think that an overly technical approach to communication is a bad idea. You are a person in the world. You're a certain age, you got a certain background, you got a certain level of this and a certain level of that, and they know that. One of the youth say, just be real. I hate it when some 25-year-old staff member tries to be my mom. You can't be my mom, I'm 20. And I said, okay, so just be real. What happens when somebody who's 50 treats you like they're your mom? And she's like, that's not as bad. But you know what I hate? When they try to act all cool. Now, I share that both because it's specific to the context, but also instead of standing here and pretending like there's 3 easy steps that I can tell you to communicate better, my answer is know yourself, know your role, and be attentive to how that person on the other side of that is going to read that, what they're going to project on you, what they're going to think about you, what their experiences with people like you have been, and try not to take that, personally. I had an interaction, I had a disaster situation, we called a response agency, but the person threatened to commit suicide, and so that response agency called the police officers instead. So the police showed up to this already sticky situation, wasn't super good, and the cop was like, why are you flipping out? I haven't done anything to you. Hold on. Yes, you haven't done anything to you, but a guy who looks a lot like you, who dresses like you, is armed like you, has maybe done some stuff to this person, and that's getting put on you, right? And so I actually said to him, this can't be the first person who hates you because you're a cop. And he's like, you have no idea. And I said, if I have no idea, then why are you pretending like this is personal? So no.
Good for you.
What?
That was good.
Well, I mean, and yeah, it was a messy situation. It all worked out. It all worked out. There were a variety of response agencies that it got covered. It got covered.
Yeah, let me follow up though real quick. Have you always been a good communicator, or did you have to practice?
Yes, you have to practice. Practice. It's a skill. Communication is a skill. Public speaking is a skill. You can get better at it. Interpersonal communication is a skill. You can get better at it. if you're really interested, I'll give you my email address and I'll send you my YouTube video. I teach online classes sometimes, and there's stuff on there. So anyway, communication's important, and you can get better at it. But my encouragement is to know where you are uniquely, and then try to play to those strengths. Right? Yeah, one over here.
Did you notice any obvious differences between the young men and the young women that you interviewed?
Like, what do you mean?
In terms of what they want, what they're looking for, what they view as positive, what they view as helpful?
I don't know. I'll have to think about that. I guess the answer is no, there weren't obvious differences. Yeah, I mean, you should know my sample size has more men than women because there are more men than women who are homeless. But nothing leaps out at me. But I'm going to analyze my data further because I have to write a dissertation about it. And if I find something, I'll let you know. Questions over here? Yeah.
Did you find, or I'm asking, that your communication style had to change to some degree by how many different types of ethnic groups that you perhaps interviewed? Because now we have a lot of children from different, even from different countries and so forth that are homeless. So I just wondered, did you get a chance to interview any of them, or did you have to change?
Yeah, I mean, I find that the homeless population is ethnically diverse. I don't know. I try to be appropriate. I try to watch the other person's body and judge what they're looking for. I couldn't give you like a rundown of everything that I did, but I find that it's more. It's less that ethnic groups determine how they behave and more kind of like how street they are. Mm-hmm. And so they're kind of like trying to figure out, you know, have you been on the street for 8 years? Because that's going to involve a certain kind of interview style. Or were you in a home but your parents moved away from Phoenix and you couch surfed for a while and then your friend's parents kicked you out, right? And so I found that I have to navigate that boundary. Like that's the thing that I'm paying more attention to.
The environment concept of the environment for being homelessness?
No, I just mean how long they've been homeless was a thing that I have to kind of figure out and respond differently to. I thought there was one, and then we'll move over here.
Yeah, my second question was, as far as, I was going to ask what percent of male to female, just to get at the mindset, you know, you make all these little comments and what their attitudes are and what they say, and I'm just curious, I mean, how that kind of broke down.
Yeah, it's like 80-20.
80-20?
Yeah, which is pretty consistent with what we see population-wise. Although I've got want to line up an interview with a woman who's got 2 kids who are under 2, and I think that's going to be. I haven't interviewed anyone who has kids while they're on the street, so I'm definitely trying to fill in the gaps. Question over here?
What was the average tenure of homelessness of the population?
I don't have that calculated. I couldn't answer
guess?
that.
Were more than more
a couple of
experienced?
years. A couple of years. Yeah.
By choice?
That's a difficult question.
Yeah. You ask them how they became homeless?
You know, the beginning of the interview is tell me a little bit about you, and I don't force them to elaborate on the whole thing. A couple of years, I would say. It's every once in a while get somebody who's been homeless for like 8 years. I think was kind of a lot when you're talking to 18 and 24-year-olds. 8 years means at least 16 if you're 24, right? I mean, I once had somebody tell me that they became homeless when they were 2, and when they ran away from home at 2, and have been on the run since. So yeah, 1 and then 2.
Do you think that your research and your findings and what you've been communicating to us today would apply to most population, not just youth?
That's a good question. So and that's why it's good for me to tell you what my methods are. Qualitative methods are best when they are contextually appropriate. I call them close to the ground, in the trenches data. So I would be hesitant to take this and without question change policies in Washington, D.C. in an adult-serving organization. Because you start changing things and the social situations change. That being said, I encourage you to use your judgment, to assess what I call transferability. It's not what I call it, it's what it's called, transferability. So you just have to look and say, do I think that he found that because of the age or because of the homelessness? And if you say because of the homelessness, then I would encourage you to draw away from that. Or you can even be inspired by the age-specific stuff to say, oh, I noticed that homeless young adults experience kind of classic American young adultness, but with a homeless twist. How does a homeless adult experience classic American adultness, but with a homeless twist? You know, what do American adults fear? You know, loss of stability, loss of, you know, these things, right? So don't just run away with it and change all the policies of your organization. But I would say, yeah, use your judgment. Yeah, back in the back.
Well, I found it kind of interesting when you said, you made a comment about what a young person was telling you, and they said, well, you said, that's what they told me. That might not be what they tell you when they're in the fight.
Right.
Is that really how it feels to them?
So, first I would just caution against really. There's no really when we're talking about communication. What is your relationship really with your brother or your sister? Well, there's all the things that you say about your brother, to your brother and your sister, but when you talk about your brother and your sister to other people, also your relationship with them changes the way that you say it, right? And so somebody whose brother just died, they change your relationship to your brother by nature of their brother just being dead, right? So is that really part of your relationship with your brother, that he's not dead? I mean, yeah, of course, like he wasn't, right?
I think you got off the track. I think what my main part of the question was is you said that's not what they would tell you when they're in the fight.
Right.
So is that what it seems like to them?
Yeah.
That they're fighting for something?
Oh, in the fight. Got it. I see what you're asking.
Or is that just something you said, or is it?
They do see contentious relationships inside organizations. When we enact policy, we have to do it very carefully, because while we can say it's the rules, it's their whole world, right? You know, and if that, I mean, it's a razor edge that you have to do that. And I've messed it up for sure, but I've also done it right. And you can make it not a fight. I once kicked somebody completely out of a housing program and had them thank me. But it wasn't easy, and it involved having a very well-established relationship with that person and being very honest. But yes, they report fights a lot.
Yeah. What percentage of the youth were aging out of the foster care system?
A lot.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a lot. I mean, I know that from my work with Stand Up for Kids. But yeah, it's very similar. It's more common that they were in the foster system sometime in their lives than they never were. It's rare that they never were. Other questions? All right, so where do we go from here? I encourage you to take these comments seriously. I think it's easy to push aside the perspective of clients because it's hard to get told when you're doing something wrong. And trust me, I know that, you know? And I just want to say, hey, I'm really busy here and I'm doing my best. But sometimes, you know, you can do better by just changing little things and still do your best. It's just better, right? However, I also encourage you to take it all with a grain of salt. In part, if you don't serve youth, or if you're not a youth-serving organization, you know, be careful about how you translate them. And similarly, this reflects what I would describe as preliminary analysis in my process. This is sort of like the movie trailer of the 300-page dissertation I have to write by May. So I'm going to engage in more thorough, basically theoretical analysis to kind of comb this stuff down. And what you sort of got is kind of like my laundry list here. What I'm pushing towards is something that's more comprehensive and more streamlined and easier to learn and to teach. So I wouldn't amend your entire program, but these are things that are worth keeping in mind. Now, I don't expect that any of you want to read my dissertation. However, because I'm a participatory action scholar and deeply committed to this community, I will also be creating a much shorter version, like in the realm of 6 pages, basically, what'd you say?
You said from 300 to
300 to 6 pages.
Interesting.
Yeah, I'll have to leave a couple things out, but some of it you won't want to read. Anyway, I'm absolutely willing to share that with anybody who gives me their email today. Expect that in like March or April of next year, when I'll be done with that whole process. Also, because I'm not a person who thinks that you should go in and research and then carry the findings away to conferences somewhere. And I think that the people who share their lives with you should share in the benefits of knowing. So I'm also completely willing, to a certain degree, like maybe 6 times, come into organizations and do trainings or staff orientations or facilitate some kind of thing for your organization. I'll do it for free, so long as, I don't know, probably a dozen organizations I couldn't handle, but I could probably do 6 or 10 of you. And that would be next spring also. I graduate, and so the horizon is not very visible for me. I don't know where I'll be living next August. But say between the months of February and May, I will have enough of this analyzed to be able to kind of chunk it down into a particular setting, given the time that you want, and train you or your staff or your bosses or whatever in any particular part of that. So as you leave, if you want either of those things, just put your name and your email on a piece of paper, and I will send you the stuff when I'm all done. That works too. And I'm done. Have a lovely